My name is Carl, and I have always loved the solitude of the forest. There was something about the rustling leaves and the distant hoots of owls that made me feel at peace. But after what happened last autumn, I swore never to set foot in those woods again. I had planned a solo camping trip in Blackwood Forest, a place known for its dense fog and eerie silence. I pitched my tent near a small clearing, close to an abandoned cabin that, according to local legends, had been deserted for decades. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog thickened, rolling in like a living entity, swallowing the trees and leaving me in an unsettling, gray abyss. Then I heard it, a whispered at first. I thought it was the wind, but the words were distinct. Ethan ... double quotes, my breath hitched. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. But there was nothing, just the thick mist curling around the trees. I forced myself to dismiss it as paranoia and climbed into my tent, zipping it shut. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like voices overlapping, speaking a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then, something brushed against the fabric of my tent. I held my breath. A shadow loomed just beyond the thin nylon wall, its form indistinct but undeniably human. I bolted, snatching my flashlight and backpack. I burst from the tent and ran toward the only visible structure in the suffocating fog. The abandoned cabin. The door creaked open under my desperate push, revealing an interior coated in dust and decay. Furniture lay in splinters, and an old rocking chair sat eerily still in the corner. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to calm my breathing. Then I saw them, figures, barely visible through the grimy window, moving slowly through the fog. Their outlines were distorted, flickering like candle flames in the mist. My stomach twisted as I realized they weren't walking, they were floating. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The air turned ice, my breath visible in the dim beam of light. In the farthest corner of the cabin, a figure stood pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It opened its mouth, and a chorus of whispers erupted from the darkness. I don't remember running. One moment I was inside, and the next, I was sprinting through the woods, fog swirling around me like ghostly hands trying to pull me back. Somehow, I found my car. I don't even recall unlocking it, just the sheer terror of starting the engine and peeling out onto the road. When I returned the next morning to retrieve my gear, there was no sign of my tent, no footprints, no disturbances in the soil. The cabin burnt to the ground. Only ashes remained, smothered by the ever-present fog. I never went back. My name is Daniel, and I have always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something about the quiet of the forest that makes me feel like I can escape the chaos of life. But what happened to me last year changed everything. I was deep in the woods, following an old trail when the sun began to set. The shadows stretched longer, and an uneasy silence settled over the trees. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach a safe spot before nightfall. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought it was my own, an echo in the emptiness. But when I stopped, they continued crunching through the leaves just behind me. I turned around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just endless trees and the dimming light of day. I shook off my fear and pressed on, but the footsteps followed. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never stopping. Dread settled in my stomach like a heavy stone. I needed to find shelter fast. That's when I saw it, an old, run-down cabin nestled between the trees. It looked abandoned, but at that moment, it was my only refuge. I sprinted to the porch, yanked the door open, and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of decay. Dust coated the floor, disturbed only by my own hurried footprints. Or so I thought. A second set of footprints trailed, right behind mine. My breath hitched. I turned back toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. The temperature plummeted, my breath turning to mist before my eyes. I wasn't alone. A creak came from the floorboards behind me. I turned, flashlight shaking in my grip. A figure stood at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its mouth stretched into a grin. But it had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. Then it moved, not walking, not running, just appearing closer, in jerky, unnatural bursts. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted for the door, yanking it open with all my strength. Cold air slammed into me as I stumbled out into the forest. The footsteps followed. I ran until my lungs burned, the sounds of pursuit never ceasing. When I finally saw my car, I nearly collapsed in relief. I fumbled with my keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the empty road ahead. But in the rearview mirror, just beyond the glow of my taillights, the figure stood watching, still grinning. I never went hiking alone again. My name is Kevin, and I never should have gone into those woods. I knew the legends, the warnings from the locals, but I thought they were just stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far. I was wrong. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my two friends, Mark and Jason. We wanted to escape the noise of the city, spend a couple of nights under the stars. The first day was uneventful, the usual campfire stories and laughter. But as darkness fell, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The woods seemed too quiet, as if every creature had disappeared. Then Jason saw him first. "Guys, there's someone over there." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent a shiver down my spine. We turned to where he was pointing, at the edge of our campfire's glow, just beyond the trees. A figure stood motionless, tall, gaunt, watching. The firelight reflected off his eyes, two glowing red orbs, burning like embers in the darkness. "Who the hell is that?" Mark whispered. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring. Jason grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the figure, but as soon as the beam hit, he was gone. Not in a running motion, just gone, as if he had never been there. We didn't sleep that night. Every so often, I swore I could hear twigs snapping just beyond our campsite. Mark tried to joke about it, but his voice was strained. By morning, none of us wanted to admit it, but we were rattled. We decided to pack up and leave as we hiked back toward the trailhead. The fog rolled in, thick, suffocating, turning the world into an endless gray void. Then, I heard it. Mark scream. I turned, just in time to see him being yanked off the trail, disappearing into the fog. Jason bolted after him, and I followed, my heart hammering. But as we stumbled through the mist, there was no sign of Mark, only the echo of his last, choked breath. Then Jason stopped dead in his tracks. "Kevin, he's here." I followed Jason's gaze and felt the blood drain from my face. The red-eyed man was standing just feet away, his grin stretching too wide, his eyes burning through the fog. Before I could react, Jason was gone, dragged into the mist by unseen hands. I heard him choking, gasping, and then silence. I ran. Branches tore at my skin as I sprinted through the trees, lungs burning, heart pounding. I didn't stop until I saw the outline of an old, decaying house through the fog. It was the only shelter in sight. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The air was stale, thick with rot. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight as I backed away from the entrance. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. No signal. My breathing was ragged, but for the first time in what felt like hours, the silence was absolute. Then, a whisper. "Kevin." The voice was right behind me. I turned slowly, my body frozen in terror. There he was, standing inside the house, his red eyes burning, his grin impossibly wide. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his outstretched hand reaching for me. My name is Nathan, and I used to be a skeptic. Ghost stories, cursed places, things that go bump in the night, I never believed in any of it. That was before I found the door. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. The trail was one I had taken a dozen times before, winding through the dense pine forest behind my grandfather's old cabin. But that afternoon, the path seemed different. The trees loomed taller, their trunks twisted as if they had grown in agony. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and then I saw it, a door, standing alone in the middle of the woods. No walls, frame, just an old wooden door with iron hinges, weathered by time but impossibly intact. It didn't make sense. My rational mind screamed at me to leave it alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and turned the rusted handle. The door opened. Beyond it was not the forest, but the dim interior of a house, an old house. Dust-filled beams of light streamed through cracked windows. The scent of mildew and decay clung to the air. Against every instinct in my body, I stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins. I spun around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breath came in short gasps as I pounded against the wood. No response. I was trapped then. I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from the hallway ahead of me. A shadow shifted in the dim light. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, motionless. Its outline was blurred, flickering like a faulty television signal. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I took a step back. The floor creaked beneath me, and in an instant, the figure moved, not walking, just appearing closer. I turned and ran, sprinting through the dusty halls, past furniture covered in sheets and rotting wood. The whispers started then, voices from unseen mouths, murmuring just beneath the edge of understanding. My legs burned as I threw open door after door, but each one led to another room, another hallway, never outside. I was trapped in an impossible maze. Then I saw at the same door I had entered through, standing at the end of a darkened corridor, my only way out. I ran for it. The footsteps behind me turned into a sprint. My fingers barely grazed the handle when icy hands clamped around my wrists. The room filled with a deafening whisper, overlapping voices screeching into my ears. I yanked away, throwing myself through the door, tumbling back into the forest. The door slammed shut behind me. I gasped for air. The forest suddenly silent again. But something was wrong. The trees were different. The sky was darker. Then I turned back to the door. It was gone. Only the empty woods remained, and the unmistakable feeling that I was no longer in the same world I had left. My name is Ryan, and I have always been a night wanderer. The silence of the woods at midnight used to feel peaceful until I learned that something in the dark was watching. It started on a camping trip. I had set up my tent deep in the forest, away from crowded trails, seeking solitude. The first night was uneventful, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But on the second night, I noticed them eyes at first. I thought they were reflections, maybe distant animals, catching the moonlight. But these weren't normal. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Dozens of them, surrounding my campsite. A chill ran down my spine as I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing. But the moment I turned the light away, I felt them again, closer, watching. I barely slept that night, convinced it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next night, it got worse. As I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps circling, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I bolted outside, flashlight shaking in my grip. The trees were empty, no wind, no movement, just silence. But when I turned toward the clearing, my stomach dropped. They were closer now. The eyes. They were higher than before, towering above me, yet there were no bodies, no figures attached to them. Just the glowing, unblinking orbs, staring with unnatural intensity. I ran. Branches whipped against my skin as I sprinted through the forest, the weight of unseen gazes pressing against me. My only thought was escape. Then, through the thick trees, I saw it a house. Old, decayed, but it had walls, a door, something to shield me from them. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. My breath was ragged as I pressed my back against the wooden panels. Silence. Then, a sound tapping on the windows. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting. The eyes were still there, right outside the glass, closer than ever. And now, there were hands, pale, elongated fingers pressing against the glass, dragging slowly across it, leaving streaks of moisture behind. A whisper filled the room. "Ryan, we see you." My blood ran cold. The windows rattled. The door creaked. I knew I couldn't stay. I turned and ran through the house, looking for another way out. The walls felt endless, the corridors stretching on forever. My pulse pounded as I found a back door, throwing it open and sprinting into the forest. Without looking back, I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I returned the next day with help, there was no house, no footprints, just the dense, empty woods. But sometimes, even now, when I look outside at night, I see them watching, unbathed, waiting. My name is Rachel, and I used to love old apartments. They had character, charm, history, but I'll never rent one again. It started the first night after I moved in. The place was perfect, high ceilings, antique fixtures, and a price so low. It felt like a steal. The landlord mentioned it had been vacant for years, but I didn't ask why. I should have. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost distant, like someone speaking through a wall. At first I thought it was a neighbor. The building was old. Maybe the walls were thin. But when I pressed my ear against the wall, the voices weren't coming from next door. They were coming from the vent. The next night, it got worse. The whispers grew clearer, urgent, overlapping. They were speaking, but I couldn't understand the words. It was like a dozen voices trapped in a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Then, I made a mistake. I spoke back. "Hello." Silence. 4. The first time, the voices stopped. The apartment felt impossibly still, the air thick with something I couldn't name. My pulse hammered as I backed away from the vent, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. Then, the whisper returned, closer, right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. I barely slept that night. By the next evening, I had convinced myself it was my imagination. The stress of moving, the creaks of an old building, I was overreacting, so I decided to prove it to myself. I grabbed a flashlight, unscrewed the vent cover, and peered inside. There was something in there, a shape small, crumpled, barely visible in the darkness. I reached in, my fingers grazing something smooth and cold. Then, it moved. A breath not mine rushed against my hand. I screamed, jerking back, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling toward the door. I didn't stop to pick it up. I ran. I spent the night at a friend's place, returning in the morning, when the daylight felt safe. But something was wrong. The vent was sealed shut, not just closed, bolted, as if it had never been touched. My flashlight was gone, too. And when I asked my landlord about the apartment's history, his face went pale. "No one has lived in that unit for 20 years, he said. Not since the last tenant disappeared." That night, I packed my things and left. I don't know what was in the vent, and I never want to find out. My name is Lucas, and I never believed in haunted objects, so I brought the chair into my house. It was an antique, heavy oak with intricate carvings on the arms and legs. I found it at an estate sale, sitting alone in the corner of a dimly lit room. The moment I saw it, I felt an odd pull toward it, like it was meant for me. The seller practically gave it away, muttering something about not wanting it in the house anymore. I ignored the warning. I shouldn't have. The first night, I placed the chair in my living room, directly across from the couch. I admired how it looked old, elegant. But when I woke up the next morning, it had moved. It was no longer facing the couch. It was facing my bedroom door. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe I had bumped into it. Maybe I was remembering wrong. But the next night, it moved again. Each morning, the chair was in a different place. Sometimes it was near the window. Sometimes turned toward a corner, but always closer to my room. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, but a cold unease settled in my chest. Then, one night, I heard it, a soft creak. I opened my eyes. My bedroom, dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I lay there, barely breathing, ears straining against the silence. Another creak, closer this time. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. My stomach dropped. The chair was in my doorway, and there was someone sitting in it, a shadowy figure, tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable in the dim light. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching me. My breath hitched, my entire body frozen in terror. Then it stood up. I didn't wait to see more. I lunged for the door, slamming it shut and locking it. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stayed like that until the first rays of dawn trickled through the window. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the chair was back in the living room, empty that morning. I dragged it outside and left it on the curb. When I came home later, it was gone. I should have felt relief. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, a soft creak closer. My name is Daniel, and until last month, I thought I knew every inch of my house. I had lived here for years, memorized every creaky floorboard, every stubborn window latch. But then, I found the room. It started when I was cleaning out the attic, sorting through forgotten boxes and dust-covered furniture. I noticed something odd. The house's exterior dimensions didn't match what I knew of the interior. There was space unaccounted for, a whole section of the house that shouldn't exist. I went searching. After hours of tapping on walls and measuring spaces, I found it, a door I had never noticed before. It was in the upstairs hallway, nestled between my bedroom and the bathroom. I stared at it, confused. How had I never seen it before? The knob was ice cold as I turned it. The room beyond was ... wrong. It was small, featureless, with bare walls and a single window. But something about it sent a chill through my spine. The air was heavy, thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, and then I blinked. The room changed. The window was gone. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. I turned around, expecting to see the open door, but it had vanished. I was staring at 4 solid walls. Panic clawed at my throat. My breaths came in short gasps. I pressed my hands against the wall where the door had been, pushing, pounding, nothing. It was as if the door had never been there. Then, the whispering started. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A low, rustling murmur, like dozens of voices speaking at once. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. They were angry. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. The room was shrinking. I was sure of it now. The ceiling felt lower. The walls were closer. The whispering turned into frantic, overlapping voices, then silence. and the door was back. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward, stumbling out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. My house felt normal again. The sounds of the outside world returned, birds chirping, cars passing in the distance. I turned back to the door. It was gone, not just locked, not just closed. Gone. The wall where it had been was now seamless, as if it had never existed. I ran my hands over the space where the frame should have been, but there was nothing, just smooth drywall. But at night, I still hear the whispering, and I know the room is still there, waiting. My name is Olivia, and I've always had an odd fascination with antique mirrors. There's something captivating about them, the way they hold the reflections of people long gone. But after what happened last month, I refuse to have one in my home ever again. It started when I found the mirror at an estate sale. It was a beautiful, ornate piece with a gilded frame, the glass slightly warped with age. The seller mentioned it had belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared decades ago. But I brushed it off as a way to make the sale more intriguing. I hung it in my bedroom the first few nights. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then I started to notice small things. When I walked past, I swore my reflection lingered just a second too long. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, like my reflection was shifting slightly, even when I was perfectly still. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise, a faint tapping sound. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the mirror. My breath caught in my throat. My reflection was awake. I was still lying in bed, frozen in terror, but my reflection was standing, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, a twisted grin stretching across its face, and then it raised a hand and tapped on the glass again. I bolted upright, my breath ragged. My reflection mirrored the motion but a second too late. Like it had to catch up. Shaking, I grabbed the mirror off the wall and shoved it face down onto the floor. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from inside the glass. Panicked, I ran to the garage, grabbed the heaviest hammer I could find, and swung it down with all my strength. The glass shattered, pieces flying across the room. I expected relief. I expected silence. But the tapping continued. The shards on the floor were still reflecting me. Every broken piece showed my face watching, grinning, moving on their own. Then, the whispers started. I fled the house that night, refusing to go back until morning. When I returned, the shards were gone. The frame was empty, clean, as if the mirror had never been there. But at night, I still hear it, soft tapping, waiting for me to look again. My name is Eric, and I should have listened to my instincts. There are some doors that should never be opened. It started when I moved into my grandmother's old house. She had passed away months before, leaving the place abandoned. It was a beautiful yet eerie Victorian home, filled with old furniture and memories of a past I barely knew. But there was one thing that unsettled me from the beginning: a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Unlike the rest of the house, this door was bolted shut with heavy locks. It looked out of place, as if it had been sealed for a reason. I asked my mother about it, but she only grew pale and muttered something about keeping things undisturbed. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. One night, curiosity got the best of me. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. I stood in front of the locked door, feeling the wood beneath my fingertips. Something about it felt wrong, like it was colder than the rest of the house. I found an old set of keys in my grandmother's desk. My hands trembled as I tried them, one after another. When I finally heard the click, a cold draft seeped from the widening crack of the door, and then I smelled it rot, stagnant, wet decay, like something had been sealed away for far too long. I pushed the door open, my flashlight casting weak beams into the darkness. The room beyond was small, empty except for a single chair in the center. And on it, something sat, a figure. It was facing away from me, its shape barely human. Bones stretched against thin gray skin, long limbs dangling over the edges of the chair. Its head twitched slightly, as if sensing my presence. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out. Then it turned. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that pulled in the light. Its mouth, wide and unnatural, curled into something that resembled a grin. And then it stood up. I slammed the door shut and stumbled backward. The locks, I needed to relock them. My shaking hands fumbled with the keys, heart hammering against my ribs. Just as I slid the final bolt into place, the door shuddered violently. The sound of nails scratching against wood filled the hallway, and then silence. I stood there, breathless, waiting. Minutes passed, then hours. The house remained still. By the time dawn's light seeped through the windows, I convinced myself that whatever I had seen was gone. But that night, I heard it. A whisper. You opened the door. Now, every night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy, stopping right outside my bedroom door. And I know one day, the locks won't be enough. My name is Jake, and I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. That had happened 3 weeks ago on a deserted highway. It was past midnight, the road stretching endlessly before me. The only company I had was the occasional flickering streetlight and the low hum of my car's engine. That's when I saw her. She stood at the side of the road, her pale arm raised in a silent request for a ride. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a thin white dress that seemed out of place in the chilly night air. Something about her felt off, but I couldn't just leave her there. I slowed down, rolling the window down slightly. Need a ride? I called out. She nodded, her lips barely parting. Thank you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She slipped into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. I noticed her feet bare and dirty, like she had been walking for miles. Where are you headed? I asked, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Just down the road, she murmured. We drove in silence. I stole glances at her from the corner of my eye. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Something about the way she sat, so stiff, so motionless, made my skin crawl. Then, after a few miles, she spoke. You should slow down. I frowned. I'm barely going over the limit. You should slow down, she repeated, turning her head toward me. That's when I saw her eyes. They weren't human. Hollow, dark voids where her pupils should have been. My breath caught in my throat as the temperature in the car dropped. My hands trembled on the wheel. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop on the empty road. My pulse hammered in my ears. I turned to look at her. She was gone. The seat was empty. The door was still locked. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror, just outside my car. She stood in the middle of the road, staring at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she lifted her arm again, pointing further, down the highway. My gaze followed her direction and my stomach dropped. Less than 100 feet ahead, the road was destroyed. A collapsed bridge loomed in the darkness, a sheer drop into nothingness. If I hadn't stopped, a gust of cold air swept through the car, and when I looked back, she was gone. I don't drive that road anymore, and I never pick up hitch. My name is Ben, and I haven't listened to the radio since that night. I was driving cross-country, alone, on an empty highway. It was past midnight, and my eyelids were getting heavy. To keep myself awake, I started flipping through the radio. Stations, searching for something: music, talk shows, anything to keep me focused. But every station was static. I kept turning the dial, frustration creeping in. Then, at exactly 666 on the AM frequency, the static cleared. a voice came through. At first, I thought it was just an old radio drama. The voice was low and distorted, speaking in a slow, deliberate tone. "Ben, don't fall asleep." My blood ran cold. I yanked my hand away from the dial. I hadn't told anyone my name. My breath hitched as I stared at the glowing numbers on the dashboard. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Then, the voice spoke again. "Eyes on the road, Ben." I nearly swerved off the highway. My hands clenched the wheel, my heart hammering. I turned the dial wildly, desperate to change the station. But the voice didn't stop. It started whispering at first. I couldn't understand the words, just the sound of something shifting through the speakers, like breathing. Then the whispers turned into laughter. Low, guttural chuckles that sent a chill through my spine. And then, the worst part, the voice said, "If you turn around, you'll see me." I refused. My eyes stayed glued to the road, hands locked onto the wheel. The air in the car grew thick, suffocating. The back of my neck prickled, every nerve screaming that something was behind me. But I didn't look. I pressed my foot down on the gas, speeding through the night. The laughter on the radio grew louder, distorting into a shriek of static. My vision blurred with panic, and then silence. The radio cut off. The screen went black. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. When I finally pulled into a gas station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee. I asked the clerk if they had ever heard of radio station 666. They just stared at me. "There's no station on that frequency," they said. "Never has been." I don't know what I heard that night, but I know one thing. I will never turn around. My name is Adam, and I don't take unfamiliar roads anymore. It was a business trip, nothing special. I had driven the same highway dozens of times, knew every exit and landmark. But that night, something was different. I missed my usual turn. I could have sworn I took the right exit, but instead of the familiar stretch of road, I found myself somewhere else entirely, somewhere that shouldn't have existed. A tunnel loomed ahead. I hesitated. I had never seen a tunnel here before. It was massive, carved into the rock like an ancient passageway. No signs, no markings, just darkness yawning before me. I slowed down, debating whether to turn back. But when I glanced at my GPS, the screen was frozen. The road behind me had disappeared into blackness. There was no turning back. I took a deep breath and entered the tunnel. The moment my tires crossed the threshold, the radio cut out. Static filled the car, crackling in eerie bursts. My headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness. The walls, rough and uneven like they had been carved by something other than human hands. Then, the whispers started. Low, unintelligible murmurs, coming from the walls. My grip on the wheel tightened as I pressed forward, my knuckles turning white. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, far longer than it should have. Then, I saw them, dot figures, standing in the tunnel. They lined the walls, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights, motionless, silent. Their heads all turned toward me as I passed, their hollow eyes reflecting the light. My pulse pounded. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The tunnel had to end. It had to. A sign appeared ahead, battered and rusted, barely hanging from the ceiling. "Turn off your headlights." My stomach dropped. I didn't dare. Whatever was in here, with me, I needed to see it coming. Then, the figures moved. I slammed the gas pedal. The tunnel blurred around me, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. The walls seemed to pulse, narrowing, closing in, and then light. I burst out onto an open road, my car skidding as I swerved to a stop. My chest heaved. My hands trembled on the wheel. The tunnel was gone. I looked back, expecting to see the dark entrance, but there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of highway. The road I knew. I never found that tunnel again, but sometimes Late at night, when I drive alone, I hear whispers through the static of my radio. Waiting. My name is Claire, and I should have trusted my instincts that night. It was late past midnight when I left my friend's house and started the long drive home. The highway was nearly deserted, just an endless stretch of dark asphalt cutting through the empty landscape. My only company was the distant hum of my tires against the road. Then I noticed the car. It appeared behind me out of nowhere, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it, another driver on the road, but something felt off. No matter how fast or slow I went, the car stayed exactly the same distance behind me, not passing, not falling back, just there. I switched lanes. It followed. I turned off onto a side road. It did too. My chest tightened. My hands gripped the steering wheel, slick with sweat. Every horror story I'd ever heard about highway stalkers flooded my mind. Then my phone rang. I jumped, nearly swerving off the road. With a shaking hand I grabbed it. No caller ID. I hesitated before answering. A whisper crackled through the speaker. "Don't stop." My breath hitched. "Who is this?" No answer, just silence. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. The car was closer now, too close. Its headlights flooded my interior, blinding me. But I couldn't see a driver, just darkness behind the glass. I slammed the gas pedal, my car lurching forward. My heart pounded as I sped down the highway, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was behind me. The headlights shrank in my mirror, then suddenly they were gone. I let out a shaky breath, my pulse still racing. I glanced at the road ahead, trying to focus. Big mistake. The car wasn't behind me anymore. It was in front of me, parked sideways across the highway, blocking my path. I screamed, jerking the wheel hard. My tires screeched as I veered off the road, narrowly missing the abandoned vehicle. My car spun out, coming to a shuddering stop in a ditch. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. When I looked up, the car was gone. No tire marks, no trace it had ever been there. But my phone buzzed again. One new message. No number. You didn't stop. Good. My name is Daniel, and I've been driving for hours, or maybe days. I don't know anymore. It was supposed to be a short trip, a late-night drive along the interstate, just a straight shot home. The roads were empty, the radio playing soft, static, my headlights cutting through the dark. But something was wrong. I started seeing the same sign over and over. At first I thought I was imagining it, but when I passed the exit 17 sign for the third time, I knew something was wrong. There was no way I had looped back. I hadn't turned. I hadn't even slowed down. Then I saw the gas station. A single flickering light, an old convenience store attached. It looked abandoned, but I needed answers. I pulled in, my tires crunching against the gravel. The air smelled like rain, though the sky was clear. Inside, the place was empty. No cashier, no customers. Just shelves lined with dust-covered snacks. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Then, the bell above the door jingled. Someone else had come in. I turned to greet them, but my words caught in my throat. It was me, a man, identical to me in every way, stood by the entrance. Same jacket, same hair, same bewildered expression. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. The air turned heavy, pressing against my chest. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for something, anything. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone, the light returned. The gas station was empty again. Shaking, I ran back to my car, slammed the door shut, and sped back onto the highway. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then I saw the sign. Exit 17. Again I screamed, slamming my fist against the dashboard. No matter how fast I drove, No matter how far I went, I always ended up back here. Then my headlights caught movement on the side of the road. It was me standing there, watching. I don't know how long I've been driving. I don't know if I'll ever get out. But I do know one thing. I'm not the only me on this road. My name is Jake, and I know every inch of my local Walmart. Or at least, I thought I did. It was late, nearly closing time, and I had stopped in for a quick snack. The store was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. I grabbed a bag of chips and started toward the checkout when I saw it, an aisle I had never seen before. It was at the far end of the store, where I knew there should have been a back wall. But now, there was a narrow passage between the shelves, leading deeper into the store. The overhead sign was blank, the lights inside dimmer than the rest of the store. The air smelled stale, like dust and something faintly metallic. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped in. The shelves were oddly tall, stretching up far higher than they should have. Each one was stocked with unfamiliar items, brands I had never heard of, packaging that looked decades old. As I moved deeper, the sound of the store faded behind me. The aisle stretched endlessly in both directions. I turned to leave. The entrance was gone. Panic settled into my chest. I spun around, trying to retrace my steps, but every turn led me deeper. The shelves began to close in, the lights flickering. My footsteps echoed strangely, like the floor was hollow. Then I heard it, a low, shuffling sound. I wasn't alone. Something moved between the aisles. At first, just a shadow at the edge of my vision. Then, closer. I caught glimpses of it, long limbs, too many joints, hollow, stretching fingers grazing the shelves as it moved. I ran. The aisles twisted unnaturally, rearranging themselves as I sprinted. The shelves were empty now, the old packaging replaced by rows of identical black boxers with no labels. The lights dimmed further until I could barely see. My breath came in sharp gasps as I rounded a corner, and there it was, the entrance. Without hesitation, I lunged through it, stumbling back into the normal, brightly lit store. My heart pounded as I turned to look behind me. The aisle was gone, just a solid wall where it had been. I staggered to the front, paid for my chips without a word, and left. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I glanced back through the glass doors, and for just a second, at the very back of the store, I saw a narrow passageway, waiting. My name is Emily, and I've always hated mannequins. Something about their frozen expressions and lifeless eyes makes my skin crawl. But after what I saw last night, I don't think I'll ever step into a clothing store again. It started when I stopped by Walmart late at night to pick up a few things. The store was quiet, the aisles nearly empty, except for a few employees stocking shelves. As I made my way past the clothing section, I noticed the mannequins. There were 5 of them, arranged in a neat row, all dressed in the same dull, generic outfits. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized they were all facing me. I swore I had walked past them from the side just moments before. A chill crept up my spine, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I kept walking, grabbing what I needed. When I passed the clothing section again, I froze. The mannequins had moved. Now, they were positioned differently, one of them closer to the aisle. I stared at them, my pulse quickening. Maybe an employee had rearranged them while I wasn't looking. That had to be it, right? I turned away, trying to shake off the unease. But as I made my way toward self-checkout, I glanced over my shoulder. One of them was missing. Panic set in. I scanned the store, my breath coming in short gasps. The employees were still stocking shelves, acting like nothing was wrong. But I knew one of them had moved. Then I heard the sound, a faint, almost imperceptible scrape like plastic dragging against tile. I turned toward the noise, and my stomach dropped. The missing mannequin was standing in the next aisle. It wasn't just placed there. It was positioned differently. One arm slightly raised, its head tilted, as if it had been caught mid-step. I ran. I abandoned my cart and sprinted toward the exit. My heart pounded as the automatic doors refused to open fast enough. Just before I stepped outside, I made the mistake of looking back. The mannequins were now all at the front of the store, lined up in a perfect row, facing me and their heads. Their heads had turned to follow me. My name is Mark, and I swear I spoke to someone who didn't exist. It was late, just past midnight, when I stopped at Walmart for some last-minute groceries. The place was nearly empty, save for a few tired employees stocking shelves. The overhead lights flickered slightly, but I barely noticed as I wandered through the aisles, grabbing what I needed. That's when I saw him, a Walmart employee, standing near the end of the cereal aisle. He was tall, thin, with a blank expression. His uniform was faded, the name tag unreadable. But when I asked him where to find the coffee, he gave me a slow nod and pointed toward the back of the store. "Thanks, man," I said, turning to follow his direction. As I walked away, I realized something odd. His name tag didn't have a name, just scratches, like something had scraped away the letters. A chill crawled down my spine, but I shook it off and kept moving. When I reached the coffee aisle, I grabbed my usual brand and turned back toward the front. That's when I saw him again, standing by the frozen foods, the same vacant stare, the same faded uniform. I froze. There was no way he could have moved that fast. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen him walk past me, but there he was, watching me. I quickened my pace, heading for self-checkout, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. I scanned my items, eager to leave, when I noticed the cashier giving me an odd look. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a laugh. "It's just weird night. That guy over there freaked me out." I nodded toward the employee by frozen foods. She frowned. "What guy?" I turned back. He was gone. The aisle was empty. A cold wave of dread washed over me. "He was just there," I insisted. "I even talked to him." She hesitated, her face palling. "Sir, there's no one working here who matches that description." I opened my mouth to argue, but something stopped me. The store's security monitor was behind the cashier, showing a grainy black and white feed of the aisles. I could see myself walking through the store, talking to no one. The cashier followed my gaze, her expression darkening. "You should go." I didn't need to be told twice. As I stepped out into the parking lot, my heart still hammering, I looked back at the store. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, the aisles eerily empty, and then, just for a moment, I saw him again, standing just inside the glass doors. But this time, he was smiling. "My name is Lisa, and I will never step foot in a Walmart after closing time again." It started with a simple errand. I had left work late and needed a few things, so I stopped by Walmart before heading home. The store was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above as I wandered through the aisles, enjoying the quiet. Then the first announcement came over the intercom. "Attention shoppers. The store will be closing in 10 minutes. I glanced at my phone. 11:50 p.m. That made sense. I hurried to grab my last few items before heading to the self-checkout. Then another announcement. "Attention shoppers. The store will be closing in 10 minutes. The same words, the same flat, artificial tone. But something was wrong. I checked my phone again. It was now 11:55. 5 minutes had passed. I frowned, looking around. The store was empty except for one employee near the front, stacking shelves. He didn't seem to react to the announcement. Then the intercom crackled to life again. "Attention shoppers. The store will be closing in 10 minutes. I shivered, my stomach twisted in unease. It was the exact same message, the exact same tone, like a recording stuck on repeat. I hurried to the self-checkout, scanning my items as quickly as possible. The speakers buzzed again. "Attention shoppers. The store will be closing in 10 minutes. The time on my phone read 12:03 a.m. The store should have already closed. I turned toward the employee at the front. "Hey, is something wrong with the announcements?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. I stepped closer, dread curling in my chest. His body was rigid, his back to me as he faced the automatic doors. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers grazing his shoulder. He toppled forward, like a mannequin. A hollow thud echoed through the store as he hit the ground, his limbs stiff, his head rolling unnaturally to the side. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't real. He had never been real. The intercom crackled again. "Attention shoppers." I bolted for the exit. The automatic doors didn't open. I slammed my hands against the glass, my reflection staring back at me in the dim glow of the store's lights. Behind me, the shelves trembled. The overhead lights flickered wildly. The mannequins in the clothing section turned one by one to face me. The intercom buzzed louder, distorting into an inhuman screech, then dashed silence. The doors slid open. I ran. When I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I saw the store in my rearview mirror. Every light inside had gone dark, but the intercom was still on, still whispering, and somehow, I knew it would never stop. "My name is David, and I don't go to Walmart after midnight anymore." It was supposed to be a quick trip. I had run out of coffee and figured I'd stop by the 24-hour Walmart before heading home. The store was nearly empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by a quiet, artificial stillness. The only sound was the faint, distorted music playing over the intercom. Then I saw him, a man standing at the far end of aisle 13. He was tall, dressed in dark, oversized clothes. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. His hands hung limply at his sides. He wasn't looking at anything on the shelves, he was just standing there. I ignored him at first, grabbing my coffee and heading toward the checkout. But as I passed another aisle, something made my stomach twist. He was there, the same man, the same stance, the same tilted head. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching. There was no way he could have moved that fast. I shook off the unease, convincing myself I was just tired. But then, as I walked past the frozen foods section, I saw him again, closer now. He was standing at the entrance of the aisle. Same lifeless posture, same empty stare. But this time, he was facing me. A chill ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave. But I hesitated long enough to see something that made my blood run cold. He didn't blink, not once. I turned and power-walked toward the self-checkout, refusing to look back. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, almost like they were reacting to my fear. My hands shook as I scanned my items, tapping the screen frantically. Then, over the intercom, a voice crackled to life. "Attention shoppers. Aisle 13 is now closed." I glanced up, my stomach twisting into knots. He was at the exit, standing between me and the doors. The automatic doors didn't open. He didn't move. He just stood there, head still tilted, waiting. My heart pounded as I turned, looking for another way out. That's when I saw the security guard watching me from behind the counter. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something between fear and pity. He lifted a hand and motioned subtly toward the back entrance. I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the aisles, knocking over displays as I ran. The storage door was already propped open, as if someone had expected me. I rushed through it, sprinting out into the cold night air. When I turned back, the store was silent. The man was gone. The next day, I drove past the Walmart, trying to convince myself I had imagined everything. But as I glanced toward the entrance, my breath caught in my throat. The store had boarded up aisle 13, no explanation, no warning, just a sign that read, "Do not enter."